Hi, Dr. Bob here to talk to you about fireworks photography. This is an area that I've dabbled in the last 5 years or so, and have learned with trial and error to get some pretty nice photographs. So let me start with a fireworks photography blunder. This is a shot I took my very first year of shooting fireworks, and it's got some cool colors, but you'll see in the center it is very washed out from overexposure, and also I go off the screen with the plumes of the fireworks. So not a very good effort there. Here's another blunder where you see a little bit of orange and white in the fireworks, but quite a bit of smoke, and so it isn't a nice, clean, crisp look. It's very cloudy looking, not a very good photograph. So with trial and error, I have been working hard to get better shots. Here's a few guys that have helped me. A gentleman in the brown shirt is named Lee. He is a professional photographer, and he has helped me quite a bit in getting my camera set up and picking the proper settings for my photo shoots the last 4 years. In the blue shirt is my friend Ken, who becomes a very good friend every July 4th as I go to his house to shoot my fireworks. Here's an example of what I've gotten with some improved settings. You'll see some vivid color and just a nice composition. I like that one a lot. So, as is our usual format with composition topics, I'm going to go through 10 tips to get better fireworks photographs. So let's dive in. Tip number one is shoot from a good location. And this is obviously important if you're going to get good shots. You want to be fairly close to the fireworks, probably a half mile or less, although I'm sure you could extend that a little bit if you have a nice clear sky. But the farther away you are, the less vivid the fireworks will be. Ideally, you would like to shoot from a dark location where there are no street lamps nearby. You want to be sitting on almost complete darkness so that you don't get ambient light sneaking into your lens when you're shooting the fireworks in a distance. This is especially important as you take longer and longer exposures of several seconds in duration. You would like an unobstructed view with no trees, houses, people in front of you. You want to just be you in the sky, so that's the goal. And then finally, if you can arrange it, and this isn't always possible, but you would like the fireworks to be downwind from you. Therefore, when the fireworks explode and generate smoke, that smoke is traveling away from you rather than towards you, where it would cloud the subsequent photo that you take. I live in Hudson, Ohio, and where I shoot from is a local park named Barlow Farm Park. Your nice typical little park that has some softball fields and so forth. Here's what it looks like. Nothing special. It's got some soccer fields on this end of the park. As you look across some of those soccer fields, you'll see a little neighborhood there in the distance beyond the tree line. And my friend Ken lives just over in that neighborhood. In fact, if you look at an overhead map, Barlow Farm Park in the green there, and Ken lives where the little A is located. So every July 4th, he becomes my very best friend and lets me set up my camera out in front of his house and get some very close shots of the local fireworks in Hudson, Ohio. Here's what it looks like from a good location. I'm out in the street, which is a little dead end into the park, right out in front of my friend Ken's house. I set my camera up on a tripod and aim towards the sky while it's still light outside. As the sun goes down and the sky darkens, it looks kind of like this, so I want to shoot above those trees up into the sky and zoom in on a spot that would be something like what I've shown here. You'll obviously need to adjust that as the fireworks go, but you can generally find the position in the sky where the explosions occur, and then you use that area trying to keep the trees and any other obstructions out of the way. So shooting from a good location is key. Tip number two, I already showed you, but this goes without saying really. You must use a tripod to get any kind of a time exposure shot. I used just a simple basic tripod that was less than $100, I think. Nothing special, but set it up on some firm footing so that you can get long exposure. This provides camera stability. It allows for those long exposure times, like I'm talking about, several seconds in duration. And it also allows you to shoot without looking through the viewfinder. Once you're set up on a particular area of sky, then you don't have to look through the little viewfinder anymore, but you can look directly at the sky and yet still control the camera, and you know that it's catching the area that you want because the camera is fixed on your tripod there. Tip number 3, and this one you might overlook, but bring along a pen light, including a backup, by all means, because when you're sitting there shooting and it's very, very dark, you'll need a little pen light to look at your camera settings to properly set this up. So this is an absolute necessity, or else you're going to really be struggling to get your camera set properly. Let me introduce tip number 4 with this photography blender. Nice colors on this one, but you'll see that I went off the screen here on my 4x6 format camera. The best way to avoid this is to shoot wide and to crop later. And I found that cropping in, unlike most photographs, doesn't seem to degrade the quality of the photos as much as it does with other types of photography. So let me show you 3 successive shots that I took in one of my photo shoots on a July 4th evening. These are 3 shots in a row. The first one, the explosion occurred down there in the bottom left, but I cropped it down to something like that. The second one was high and more central, but I cropped it down to something like that. And then the third one was down in the bottom center, so I cropped it down to something like that. So shoot wide and then crop later on, and that way you'll get the full effect of the fireworks. Tip number 5, use manual focus and set it at infinity. On my camera, Nikon D300, I have a choice for my focus. I can do autofocus continuous, autofocus single, or manual. And so I set the focus at manual. I also then set my lens at infinity, so I'm shooting out at the greatest focal length possible for that particular lens. I typically use a 17 to 55 lens for this, and probably am in the mid-range between those two values in terms of focal length. The reason for this is that you cannot use autofocus on the distant sky. The camera will just zoom in, zoom out, trying to find a focus, and by then the fireworks are gone, and you're frustrated because you didn't get a shot. So go to manual focus, set it at infinity. Tip number 6, use a low ISO value. And by that I mean 100 to 400, probably 100 or 200 would be the best. Now this is a little counterintuitive because you think, wow, it's very dark out there, I'm going to have to push the ISO up high to get my shots, but that's not really true. You want the night sky to be black, and what you're picking up is very bright light from fireworks displays, and believe me, it's very bright. So 100 or 200 ISO is perfectly adequate. That's where you want to be, and you'll get your best quality pictures at low ISO as opposed to ISO of 800 to 1600 or higher. Tip number 7, use manual exposure mode. This is the back display on my Nikon D300, showing that I'm set at manual rather than in programmed mode or automatic mode or aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode. I just want to go to manual, where I am controlling the exposure time and the aperture completely independent of what the camera thinks would make a good exposure. Tip number 8, use a relatively small aperture. Typically around f11 turns out to be a very good number. Again, you think, wow, that's pretty tiny aperture for shooting in the dark sky. But again, you have good brightness with the explosions, and the background sky you want dark. So this works out quite well, and it keeps everything in nice focus. Tip number 9, you must use long exposure times or shutter speeds to get the kind of photographs that we're interested in. Here's an example of setting it at 3 seconds, which would be a typical exposure time and probably middle of the road for what I like to shoot. The reason for long exposure times is that it allows for the colorful plumes after the explosions to be fully captured on a single shot. And this is key to get the real nice color filling up your whole frame. You should begin your exposure just as the shot is about to explode in the sky. And once you play around with this, you'll be able to hone in your timing. And you'll see the little trail of light as it goes up into the sky. And right as it's peeking out, that's when you start. So you catch the explosion and the plumes, and then you're done. Here's a fireworks photography blunder. A little dark here, but you'll notice the center of this is kind of like a black hole. And that's because I began the exposure too late, after the explosion had already occurred and the plumes were starting to go out. That's when I opened the shutter, which was too late to fully capture this particular display. In order to get long exposure times, there are specific techniques that you can use, and I will show you a few examples of this in a moment. One way is to simply set a fixed shutter speed, such as 2 seconds up to 4 seconds, and you can play around with that to see what you like. Another is to control your exposure manually with what's called the bulb mode, and that's available on virtually all SLR cameras, to my knowledge. That lets you press the shutter release button, begin the exposure, and once you let up on the button, the exposure ends. So you can stay down on the button for several seconds if you'd like. Using a remote release to activate the shutter is a very good idea in order to keep you from having camera movement that you would have when you actually physically press the shutter release button with your finger. And I'll show you an example of that. Then one other technique that you may want to experiment with is intermittent covering of your lens while the shutter is open, and doing that in a manual fashion to get long exposures or double exposures, and I'll show you an example of that. So using the long exposure times, the bulb mode lets you have total manual control over the length of your exposure. Here's a remote release that wires in directly on my camera, but also has a little remote electronic system in my right hand. In many cameras, you can purchase an additional remote release, which makes it very nice to take shots without physically touching the camera at all, where you get your best stability. And then here's that technique I mentioned, where you would begin your exposure, preferably in the bulb mode with a remote release system. You cover the lens itself with a nice dark object, such as a CD case holder. And when you see the beginning of the explosion, you come down with this, expose as much as you want, and then place it back up in the original position. And you can do all this while the shutter is still open, as long as you're in a dark area and you don't get much light sneaking into the camera itself. And you can take multiple fireworks explosions with superimposed images using this technique. There is an exception to tip number 9, and that is if you don't have the ability to use these type of manual settings. For example, if you have a small point and shoot camera, many of them at least have a scene mode called fireworks. This is a little Nikon Coolpix S630, I believe, and you'll see that one of the many options for scene mode, along with portrait and landscape and night portrait and so forth, one of the options is fireworks. And what does this do with the camera? Well, a few things that we've already talked about. One is that it slows the shutter speed way down, so ideally you would want to shoot these off a tripod. And secondly, it automatically focuses the camera at infinity, so you don't get stuck in that autofocus problem where you are unable to focus on your subject. And finally, tip number 10, be creative. Here's the way Walt Disney does it. The Magic Kingdom. This looks a little bit too fabricated to me, but it's very pretty. Here's a shot that I took up in the top right of some patriotic fireworks, red, white, and blue, and I superimposed that on a stock photograph of an American flag. So it makes for a nice creative composition. In summary, here are the 10 tips for good fireworks photography. Number 1, shoot from a good location. Number 2, use a tripod. That's a necessity. Number 3, bring along a pen light. You'll really need it to set your camera while you're sitting there in the dark. Number 4, shoot rather wide as long as the trees are out of the way, and then you can crop down later and you'll be surprised at how nice the images are. If you've got 6, 8, 10 megapixels, you're fine. Number 5, use manual focus set at infinity. Autofocus is off. Number 6, use a low ISO, preferably 100 or 200, so you'll get your best quality. Number 7, use manual exposure mode rather than shutter priority or aperture priority or programmed. That gives you total control over the camera. Number 8, use a relatively small aperture, such as an f of 11. Number 9, use long exposure times. In other words, a shutter speed of 2, 3, 4 seconds, somewhere in there, to get the kind of shots we're talking about. And then finally, number 10, be creative. Alright, well that does it for my fireworks photography tips. From here I'd like to go into the actual shots that I've taken, some of my favorites, over the last 4 years of shooting, from 2007 through 2010. These are all taken at the same location there at Barlow Farm Park. In 2007, I was using a Nikon D70, and you'll see the settings at the bottom of each photograph, and I'll comment on those periodically. So here are some shots from 2007. Pretty colors. And in terms of the cropping, the rule of thirds does kind of apply. You don't want these to be totally centered. It's less interesting. This one I thought looked like a distant galaxy, something you see on Star Trek. It's a very vivid one, almost overexposed. Here's a 2 different color. This was actually 3 explosions, I believe. This is one where I used the CD case in front of the lens and actually got a 15-second exposure, although you'll see a few discontinuities in the plumes. So it's not the best shot, but you'll get an idea of what you can do with multiple exposures there. And finally from 2007, this one, which I didn't recognize to be a heart until I got home and I viewed it. Surprise, surprise. In 2008, I was using a Nikon D2X. Some of the shots will be monochromatic, like this one. Here's when I decided to crop vertically, just for a change of pace. This one went off the frame just a touch. And you'll see the explosion site always tends to be a little overexposed. Some beautiful contrast of colors. And these are settings that I would strongly recommend. ISO 100, f of 11, and an exposure time around 3 seconds. That's right where you want to be. Poof explosion there. This is one of the ones that's a little tinkling down in the sky with a funny sound. This one I thought looked like a spider or a sea urchin or something. Very artsy. Kind of neat. It's a very full one. Multiple colors. 6-second exposure. In 2009 I was using my current camera, Nikon D300. You'll see I had the moon in the background to deal with. I like these types with multiple different colors. You'll see that I was playing around with the ISO and the f-stop just to try to find the optimal combination. So it's a little bright with this moon in the background. Again, a vertical crop. ISO 400, you don't lose much quality there, but probably 100 or 200 would be better. This one had pretty colors, but it's an overexposure. Too bright. Sometimes you'll get lucky and get two distinct ones in the same shot. Here's the one that I opened this talk with. You'll see the settings here. That's a 2.5 second exposure. 2010. Again, using the Nikon D300. Got a series of shots. We're doing a red, white, and blue theme, though the red sometimes looks a little orange to me. Again, I like these multicolored ones. I think they're very neat to see. One of our doctors at Fairview Hospital, where I delivered this talk in April of 2011, talked about these photographs as painting with light, which I thought was an apt description of these type of photographs. Interesting effect there. This one was rather cute with the mama explosion and the little baby explosions. Well, I think I caught the end of one, the green one, and the beginning of the other, if I'm not mistaken. So for the first shot in 2010 here. And finally this red, white, and blue. So that's it. That is my fireworks gallery. I'm anxious to go shoot some more this July 4th again, and I trust that you'll be able to use this information to get better fireworks shots yourself on Independence Day. So good luck.